and to the publisher to purchase a hard copy of the full report. We have a great panel of experts lined up to discuss what the U.S. can do better to protect civilians worldwide. The panel will be moderated by Mark Snyder from International Crisis Group, who is an expert in his own right. And with that, I turned it over to Mark. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Krista. And I want to thank Oxfam America and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars for organizing today's panel to launch, really, Oxfam International's report for a safer tomorrow, protecting civilians in a multipolar world. And I'm particularly grateful for the invitation to moderate this distinguished panel because of the quality of that report, because of the crucial importance of finding better ways to protect civilians, and because the International Crisis Group has been promoting responsibility to protect ever since our president, Gareth Evans, to some degree came up with a certain definition of that concept several years ago. Gareth, by the way, will be here at the center a month from today, October 28th, to discuss this same issue and to release his book, The Responsibility to Protect Ending Mass Atrocity Crimes Once and for All, which in many ways is complemented by the Oxfam report. It lays out the steps needed now to embed responsibility to protect as an international standard of conduct and to give it life, as the Oxfam report underscores, from local to national to global levels. The crisis group's very existence really derives from anger at the institutional and leadership failure to protect civilians from the genocide in Rwanda and the massacres of Srebrenica. Those horrors caused George Mitchell, Morta Bromwich, Mark Malloch Brown, Steve Solars, Fred Cooney, and George Soros to come together to create the crisis group in 1995. And our reports from some 60 countries around the world ultimately are aimed at trying to identify beforehand the conditions that are likely to produce conflict and mass violence against civilians, to recommend what needs to be done and who needs to do it to prevent or stop those atrocities, and then to advocate those policy actions directly to decision makers. The Holocaust led many of us to explore our own ways to extend never again beyond rhetoric and to build effective laws, policies, and institutions to hem in dictators, governments, and non-state actors who act without regard for the value of human life. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been some progress. First, the expansion of the UN's peacemaking, peacebuilding, and peacekeeping capacity. Second, the demand that those responsible for the bloodshed and atrocities must be held accountable. And that's led to the establishment of special international war crimes tribunals and the Permanent International Criminal Court. And finally, the UN General Assembly adopted the concept of a responsibility to protect in the Millennium Plus 5 outcome document after pressure from hundreds of organizations, NGOs around the world, including Oxfam and the Crisis Group. The responsibility to protect doctrine in effect sidesteps the national sovereignty versus humanitarian intervention argument by establishing that a fundamental responsibility of the sovereign is the protection of civilians, and thus the primary obligation rests with the nation state to prevent human rights abuses within its own territory. But the change in the 2005 World Summit document makes clear that in extreme cases, when, and I quote, genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, unquote, occur, and the nation state is either unable or unwilling, or is itself complicit, then the responsibility must shift to the wider international community. And this notion of protection encompasses three critical components: the responsibility to prevent, the responsibility to react, and the responsibility to rebuild. And with respect to the responsibility to prevent, it means making every effort to address both root causes and immediate sparks of internal conflict and other man-made crises that put populations at risk. The responsibility to react means to respond to situations of compelling human need with effective measures across the spectrum: diplomacy, humanitarian response, special envoys, special rapporteurs, commissions of inquiry, arms embargoes, targeted sanctions, economic and financial sanctions more broadly, preventive deployment of military forces, for instance, EUFOR on the Chadian border. Only in the extreme does it involve coercive military force, and even then, only under legitimate authority, proportional, strict adherence to international humanitarian law. And as the Oxfam report indicates, that has not always been the case. The responsibility to rebuild means, particularly after a military intervention, full assistance with recovery, reconstruction, and reconciliation. Now, supposedly, this is what was accepted in 2005. In fact, Secretary General Kofi Annan made the point that this was the multifaceted concept that was being incorporated. Unfortunately, in virtually every instance, we still fall short of an adequate response, either on the part of the United States or on the part of the United Nations. On prevention, there's no internationally accepted, legitimized, and global early warning system. In fact, there's no organized system of any kind. On reaction, there's no sense of obligation, nor developed capacity to immediately take steps, such as the tools that have been laid out, to deal with the potential for serious conflict, such as in Bolivia today, or to deploy sufficient police trainers in Afghanistan, judges in Haiti, or military peacekeepers in Darfur. And on rebuilding, we've all seen the limitations that exist in the capacity of the United States with respect to civilian response, and for that matter, with respect to the international capacity after post-conflict begins. Today, the Oxfam report cites 46 countries with a high risk of conflict. Other reports this year have indicated, again, serious threat against individual civilians and for the potential for atrocities exist in 20 or 25 countries. In fact, Dr. Barbara Harf concluded that there are still 7 countries with a high risk of genocide this year. Now, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon stated recently in his first clarification of R2P, he said it would be neither sound morality nor wise policy to limit the world's options to watching the slaughter of innocents or to send in the Marines. Unfortunately, at this point, there is no commitment that guarantees that when we see Rwanda developing, that the international community will act. And it is in that respect that the Oxfam report is so important. And so let me, at this point, turn the stage over to our panelists. I'm going to introduce them all now, and then they're going to continue to describe the report and to discuss it. First, Edmund Cairns, Senior Policy Advisor, Oxfam, Great Britain. He's worked in a number of roles for Oxfam, including as Emergencies Manager in Ethiopia and Sudan, and as Oxfam's first representative in Russia when it opened there in 1992. He's led Oxfam's advocacy in a series of issues over recent years, stemming from beginning with the Rwanda genocide to Iraq and Darfur. And he is the major author of the report that is being released today. Then next we're going to hear from Eric Schwartz, Executive Director of the Connect U.S. Fund. Prior to joining the fund in a full-time capacity, Eric serves as the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's Deputy Special Envoy for Tsunami Recovery. In that role, he worked with the Special Envoy, former President Clinton, to promote both coordination and accountability and best practices in the recovery effort. And prior to that, he served as a lead expert for the congressionally mandated Mitchell-Gingrich Task Force on United Nations Reform. And I think I'll go back to when he served on the National Security Council from 1993 to 2001 as Senior Director and Special Assistant to the President for Multilateral and Humanitarian Affairs. The next speaker will be Alex Thayer, who's the Senior Rule of Law Advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace and an expert group lead on the Genocide Prevention Task Force. He's director of the Project on Constitution-Making, Peace-Building, and National Reconciliation, director of the Future of Afghanistan Project, and has worked in Afghanistan virtually for the past 15 years. If there's somebody you want to know who knows Afghanistan, it's Alex. And not finally, but in addition, we have Tori Holt, Senior Associate at the Henry Stimson Center, where she co-directs the Future of Peace Operations program, which addresses U.S. policy and international capacity for advancing security and stability in war-torn societies. She currently heads the expert group on military options of the Genocide Prevention Task Force, and if there's anybody who knows what is right and what is wrong about UN peacekeeping, it's Tori. So let us begin now with Ed Kearns.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. And can I just say how delighted I am to be here in this distinguished setting and with such eminent colleagues this afternoon. You know, sometimes it's good to stand back from Georgia and Afghanistan and Iraq and all the crises that dominate the policy making in the United States government and in all governments around the world, and certainly dominate our lives in humanitarian agencies like Oxfam. It's good to take time to look at how the world is changing and what that means for us all. And that fundamentally is what Oxfam's new report is trying to do. In the last couple of years, it's become fashionable, I think is the word, to celebrate the decline in the number of conflicts since the end of the Cold War. And despite Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, we are told, according to Steven Pinker at Harvard, for instance, that we are living at the most peaceful time in our species' history. Well, essentially, I'm here this afternoon to tell you that if you're working on the ground in most of the world's armed conflicts, as Oxfam does, it doesn't quite feel like that. Sure, the number of armed conflicts has declined quite substantially since the early 1990s, but I don't think that means that there's any serious evidence that that trend is going to continue. And if you look at the combined effects of climate change, continuing poverty and inequality, proliferation of arms and many other things, I'm just as worried that conflicts may increase in number in the future years as that trend may continue. Right now, there are no serious figures, really, global figures of the number of civilians that are threatened by violence in conflicts around the world. Nevertheless, the scale is staggering. We're talking, according to the latest figures, of 1,500 people a day dying in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in that country's shamefully forgotten conflict. If we go back till the beginning of the current conflict, if you want to put it like that, in 1998, we're talking about that country losing 8% of its population from the direct and mainly indirect effects of that conflict. If the United States lost that proportion of people, we'd be talking about 25 million people, more than the state of Texas. True, no other country in the world has that kind of death rate from conflict. But every day, my colleagues in Oxfam are working with literally hundreds of thousands of people around the world who have suffered sexual violence, rape, displacement or injury from today's other conflicts. At any given moment, Oxfam is providing humanitarian aid to about 3 million people around the world, and the great majority of them are the victims of today's still unresolved conflicts. And if you look to the future, we're thinking of the kind of world that major international NGOs will be working in 2015, 2020. And when we do that, we're worried that we're going to be working in a world with more conflict, not less. In the coming decades, half of humankind may be at risk and an increased risk of conflict because of climate change. There was a report that came out a few months ago which estimated, and it's only an estimate, but it estimated that 102 countries with a combined population of 3.9 billion people would have an increased risk of political instability or violent conflict because of climate change. And right now, the world's failure to do enough to reduce poverty and inequality, that creates its own security risks. According to somebody who once upon a time was a neighbour of you here in DC at the World Bank, Paul Collier, and is now one of my neighbours in Oxford as Professor of Economics, in the next 5 years, any of the poorest countries in the world has a 1 in 6 chance of falling into war just because of its poverty and inequality. So essentially, the first reason Oxfam's wanting to publish this report today is just to do a wake-up call to a wider audience, the audience beyond the policy community, that the chances that we'll see more civilians threatened by conflict, a larger number of conflicts in the coming years, is very real. If we all face an enormous challenge to respond to conflict now, that challenge may get bigger. And I think we all share an interest, all of us in this room share an interest to make that wake-up call to the wider audience, to challenge the crisis fatigue that I certainly see after people have watched Darfur on TV screens for 5 years and most other conflicts for much longer. And if we had an interest in challenging that crisis fatigue 3 weeks ago, well, we certainly do now, as our politicians and publics, understandably, may be fixated on the international financial crisis. But there's a second reason why Oxfam is publishing this report today, and that's to show more positively that something can be done. You know, many people say that little can be done to protect civilians from atrocities around the world, but that's not true. Let's just cast our minds back to Kenya in January this year, when post-election violence was threatening wider conflict. Many East African analysts used the phrase another Rwanda then, that might happen in Kenya to begin this year. But that didn't happen. And why? Because after international pressure, there was effective action at many levels in Kenya, from local civil society right up to Kenya's political leaders. And we can all draw various lessons from Kenya this year, positive lessons, I think. But one of them, and it links in with what Mark's just said, because Oxfam is totally committed to the responsibility to protect, one of those lessons is that the Kenya crisis this year showed that the responsibility to protect could have a tangible impact on a real crisis. The international pressure and support on Kenya's political leaders, the messages of Kofi Annan, the UN and others, did a lot to cite for responsibility to protect, to remind Kenya's political leaders that they had that responsibility to their own citizens. So despite all our frustrations that, you know, it has taken some time to move responsibility to protect from concept and agreement to practical action, I think the Kenya crisis this year shows us that potential, which can be built on, and I applaud Gareth Evans' excellent book about that. Our own report shows many other examples of what can be done when there is the political will to protect civilians. But let me draw to a conclusion with 4 points that I think my distinguished panellists will pick up on, perhaps in more detail. The first is, let's just remind ourselves of a positive recent trend that has had far too little attention. For much of human history, most conflicts have ended by military victory by one side or another. That does not appear to be true anymore. Between 2000 and 2005, between 3 and 4 times as many conflicts were resolved by negotiation as they were by military victory. Let's not be naive. Sometimes a military operation is part of a solution, but it just seems to be a sensible prioritization of resources for any government to put significant and sufficient effort into its diplomatic capacity to resolve conflicts. Secondly, as I said, sometimes there can be a military component to the solution, but that's almost always undermined if that military effort produces excessive civilian casualties. Somebody that I was deeply indebted to in writing this report was Michael O'Hanlon over at the Brookings Institution, who told me about how US forces had learnt that lesson, or possibly relearnt that lesson, in Iraq in the last few years. I think all I'd add is, from Oxfam's experience in far too many conflicts around the world, there's almost a universal truth that governments increase insurgency, increase insecurity, unless they are absolutely careful to minimize civilian casualties. The third point is peacekeeping. I think we all know that the capacity and quality of peacekeeping missions around the world is inconsistent, to put it mildly. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Oxfam has been doing some surveys in the last few weeks of about 30 communities in the east of the country. And one of the things that we've been asking people is what they think of the performance of the UN mission Monarch. And there were very few positive comments. One comment that sort of summed things up was that Monarch was more an observer than a protector, which is very sad. But despite that, you can't look at Chad or Darfur without coming to the conclusion that unless the peacekeeping missions there are substantially and urgently improved, then the prospects for civilians there and the whole situation there is very bleak indeed. So it is vital to improve and expand the performance of peacekeeping missions around the world. And obviously that doesn't fall to the United States alone, but the US role is crucial in that. And finally, final point is conventional arms control. I'm reminded by a sentence that I read in Post-American World, the rather provocatively titled book by Fareed Zakaria earlier this year. And one of the things that he said was that In an age of rising new powers, the United States' overriding goal should be to create a structure of rules, practices, and values by which the world will be bound. Well, that seems eminently sensible to me, and I think in our field, in peace and security, a glaring example of that is to control the export of conventional weapons. I realise that the United States has relatively tough arms export controls itself, but they are undermined all the time by loose controls around the world. In the next few weeks, the UN General Assembly's First Committee will be debating whether to initiate serious negotiations for an international arms trade treaty, an idea which is supported by about 3/4 of the world's governments. I think there couldn't be a better test than that of whether the United States has the will to work with a majority of world opinion to build up those new roles to protect civilians. Let me finish by saying all these challenges are, of course, not for the United States alone. That would be silly. You don't need me to tell you that China and India are rising, Russia is rising again. We are living in a changing world. All these challenges on how to protect civilians are a challenge to all governments, and I would say they're mainly a challenge to the world's most powerful governments. And that's why Oxfam is not just having this kind of event here in Washington today, but in publishing this report today, where we're saying the same kind of call to governments around the world. Like the International Crisis Group, my colleagues are talking to governments in Beijing and Delhi and Moscow and elsewhere, asking them how they can do more to protect civilians as well. But of course, what the United States can do more is absolutely central to any solution. And so I think it's really important that NGOs here do come to call on the new president, whoever he may be, to do more to protect civilians around the world. And I guess it's in that spirit that, like you, I'm sure, I'm really looking forward to hear from our eminent panel this afternoon about what precisely the United States could do more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just turn to Eric, and you can make the first response to that question.
I'll do my best. Thank you, Mark. And also, I want to first thank Oxfam for the invitation, but also thank Oxfam for this report. Oxfam has demonstrated over the past many years, it really has set the standard for an organization that is providing assistance overseas, set the standard for the concomitant responsibility of an aid provider, also to provide expert analysis and advocacy on these range of issues. And there are so many other organizations that are now in that game, but I think Oxfam has really set the standard. And it's critical because it's those who are on the ground who really have the best capacity to talk to policymakers. And I think maybe during the discussion we could talk about the role of civil society and the importance of government recognizing that role on issues like this, a recognition that I don't think our current administration has always seen the importance of, and we can talk about that. I like lists because they help to focus the mind and move from analytical judgments to what actually needs to happen in the policy world. I'm a little bit at a disadvantage in coming up with a list here because I was asked to address the diplomatic elements of this, and much of my career has been at the NSC, where you're actually not a diplomat. But I'll do my best, and normally I like to come up with 10 lessons or 10 to-dos, but for some reason I've come up with 9 in this paper. As I say, I've been asked to address the diplomatic aspects of the protection of civilians and the responsibility to protect. But I'm also going to try to address elements relating to information collection, to norms, and 2 areas that I don't think were included in the general charge to this group, but I think are very relevant. And I guess I went about this task as if I were in a new administration and sort of asked to come up with a series of measures to try to achieve some of the objectives in the Oxfam report, or at least kind of make progress on some of the objectives. And I guess the first and most important recommendation I would make is that leadership must come from the very top. Capacity is important, it's critical, but it's only a necessary condition for protection of civilians. It's really about political will. And it's got to come from the very highest level of the U.S. government. In my view, in a major statement or series of statements, the President of the United States needs to articulate his support for protecting civilians in conflict, that the United States will adopt a multifaceted approach to these humanitarian obligations. Whether or not the President calls that R2P or something else, is, frankly, for me, is not critical, but the concept has to be clear. And it not only has to reflect a commitment to address the politics behind conflict, which is very important, because the politics and the security situation creates the environment in which civilians are at risk, but also must address the suffering, civilian suffering, before the end of conflict. And to be sure, peacekeeping operations and greater support, U.S. participation in peacekeeping operations, and greater support for international humanitarian and law and institutions are all part of this commitment. But it also means putting much greater emphasis on the very much neglected tools of conflict prevention and early warning. And a major expression from the President is important because it sets the tone for a new administration. It also enhances the likelihood of real support for those necessary enhancements to capacity, which, again, are not sufficient to address the issue, but need to be there. The second element that I would identify, if addressing these issues, these requirements, these needs, is a presidential priority, there's no question that we need a more coherent and integrated successor to the variety, the smorgasbord of administration efforts to promote planning on these issues. And it must embed protection into the broad range of efforts for political and military planning in the context of conflict. Not only must the White House play a key leadership role in ensuring early responses to fashioning diplomatic efforts, that response must be truly integrated. When I say that, I mean it means including those in government who come to these issues through a rights framework. It also means bringing together the parts of the government that are dealing with these issues on a regional basis, as well as those who are dealing with them on a functional basis. And this is not as easy and obvious as it always sounds. And we, in the Clinton administration, I think, made some mistakes. Agreements on Sierra Leone and the Congo were supported by the U.S. government, I think, in many cases without adequate contributions from all of the stakeholders, and thus some important errors were made, as we can discuss. Third, we must strengthen the institutions of government that are on the lookout for impending genocides. Now, I've been out of government for a few years, so I'm not sure that these I'm sure these mechanisms have evolved in ways that only an insider can fully appreciate. But the National Intelligence Council has been responsible for regular reporting on internal instability, AIDS, conflict. Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation has important responsibilities on these issues, as does the Conflict Prevention Office of the State Department's Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, as does the NSC Policy Coordination Office Committee on these issues. But reports continue to suggest a rather disparate range of activities in this regard, and a new administration, again, must work to integrate them so that we have a coherent process of early warning. Fourth, and this goes directly to one of the recommendations that Oxfam made, was we have to develop effective and more cooperative, frankly, strategies at the Security Council to work with Russia and China if we're serious about Oxfam's recommendation regarding the increased responsibility and accountability of the Council on these issues. But we can't ignore the fact that there's going to be some tension between our goal of doing this, seriously engaging China and Russia, and our goal of zero tolerance for war crimes. And I don't presume to offer the template for how to address this tension, but it's going to be there, and it's going to have to be managed in a way that far more effectively than we've done so far. Fifth, I think we have to practice at home what we preach abroad. If we have any hope of being effective in diplomatic efforts to address prevention and conflict response, there's quite a bit in the Oxfam report on the war on terror. I think that this recommendation means a newfound respect on the part of the United States for international humanitarian law in the war on terror, as well as a willingness to use international instruments such as the ICC that play an important role in addressing the issue of abuses and are widely accepted by the international community, by our friends, our allies, and other major stakeholders. Sixth, I think we should take the prior point, the point I just made, a bit further, and be willing to support the development and promotion of new standards and norms relating to the protection of civilians in armed conflict. My colleague mentioned one relating to arms traffic. I'll mention another. I see in the audience, I think I see in the audience, my eyes aren't so good, a representative of the head of CIVIC, the Campaign for Innocent Victims of Violence. Is that what it's called? In conflict. There's a campaign with the support of Senator Leahy and others that's trying to break new ground regarding compensation for victims of armed conflict, even when their victimization is not the result of a violation of international humanitarian law. I think we should be prepared to really play a strong leadership role on these kinds of efforts, as that will enhance our own credibility, and not to mention enhancing the well-being of civilian victims of conflict. Seventh, we should strongly support enhanced capacity to promote effective diplomacy within the UN system, recognizing and seeking to reestablish the legacy of Dag Hammarskjöld. As a practical matter, this means substantially strengthening the UN's Department of Political Affairs, as well as interagency mechanisms like the Interdepartmental Framework for Coordination on Early Warning and Preventive Action, which promotes preventive action among some 20 UN agencies. It also means concerted efforts to promote Security Council activism and involvement in fact-finding, to strengthen recent trends in that regard, to help lay the predicate for engagement by the Council on issues relating to the responsibility to protect. If you send people out there, if you send ambassadors out there, they develop stakes in the outcome. My personal view is, and this is only my personal view, that there are probably better jobs in the UN system for a senior U.S. official than Undersecretary for Political Affairs. I think there are great advantages to having a non-American in that job, although I think the world of Lynn Pascoe. I think he's terrific. And I certainly wouldn't recommend giving up a position without getting one, but I think there are advantages that in terms of complementarity of diplomacy when we have allies in that department who are not of us. Eighth, I think we should similarly work to strengthen the capacity of regional organizations to promote diplomacy, in particular the African Union. And ninth, and finally, and I'm searching for the 10th recommendation, and maybe some of you can help me come up with it, but a new president must strongly promote increases, it seems to me, in funding for civilian capacity within the Department of State, should build on and enhance efforts at transformational diplomacy initiated by Secretary of State Rice, designed in large measure to get our diplomats out into the field and in the center of the kinds of contingencies that put the lives of civilians at such serious risk, or at least more in the center. Now, much of these enhancements, as I say, relate to capacity, as they should. But as I said in my first point, this is primarily about political will, and a new and strengthened U.S. commitment in this area will require the active and enthusiastic engagement and support of our next president.
I hope that somebody else will come up with a 10th point before the afternoon is over. But thank Eric and turn to Alex.
Thanks. You can consider everything I say as the 10th point. Eric's manifesto. I want to thank Oxfam and ICG as well for having me here, and more importantly for doing this report. As I was saying to Ed when we were standing up here, Oxfam actually sent me out into the wilds of Afghanistan in 1994 in the middle of a war with very little pay to learn a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today. So again, I thank them for that, because it has helped inform me. I also wanted to start off by saying that today, or at least at sundown today, moonrise today, is one of those great convergences when it's the Jewish New Year, Eid, and I understand it's also Confucius Day. That, I admit, was a Google find. I didn't know that in advance. But the thing that strikes me when talking about these issues is that really fundamentally the protection of civilians is condemned by all religions and has been since the beginning of almost all of those religions. And I think it's important for us to step back and remember that, because one of the things that was remarked in the beginning of this discussion is that certainly the last century has seen amazing progress as far as the normative tradition of the protection of civilians. I mean, it's important to remember that. I mean, 60 years ago, we saw this wealth, this explosion internationally of all of these different norms and treaties, genocide prevention, human rights, Geneva Conventions, and so on. But as somebody who works on constitutions a lot, I think that the biggest lesson that I've drawn from that is that it's a lot easier to write a constitution than it is to implement one. And I think what we're talking about today, that this report focuses on, and that the work that we have been doing on the Genocide Prevention Task Force, which will be launching its report in December, are very much focused on this question of implementation. It's sort of the and then what question of responsibility to protect and all of these rights that are fundamental. I mean, I do think it's critical, and I in no way mean by saying that to diminish how fundamental it is to have an almost universal normative framework. But at the same time, it's also critical to look at the dramatic failings that Ed outlined, and to understand why that gulf exists. And I think that Eric really hit the nail on the head, that obviously the biggest question is, in many ways, is political will, not only of people here, but people working on the ground, people in governments, people in militaries, that ultimately it's people doing this to people, and we have to remember that these are individual decisions that are ultimately made to protect civilians or to harm civilians. But I think that we can do, in short of suggesting that we change human nature, I think that there is a lot that we can do to actually increase our capacity to deal with these problems, or even better, to prevent them. So I want to outline two brief things. I think it really keys off of what Mark said about this sort of prevent, react, and rebuild idea. In many ways, I think I'm just going to sort of break that down into two categories, because I think that the prevention piece is so similar to the rebuild piece in a way, that the remarks that I'll focus on there, and that's really the bulk of what I'm going to talk about. And then the react piece is I think what we might call sort of, crisis, mid-crisis protection. In other words, you have two different things. One is that you're trying to prevent a crisis from breaking out in which civilians might be targeted. And then the second is that you're trying to protect civilians while there is a crisis. And I'm going to focus on the former, but I'll say a few words about the latter. my focus on the former, I really think, is for having spent a lot of time in the last year thinking about this issue, that, for my money and all of ours, because that's what we're talking about in some ways, the best way to prevent atrocities is really to prevent wars. And I also believe that prevention is possible. If we apply resources in a strategic and concerted approach, I think very much along the lines of what Eric was outlining. Prevention is cheaper, both fiscally and morally, for us to engage in. And effective prevention actually allows us to deal much more effectively with the crises that we don't prevent. In other words, when you look at one of the problems that we've had in the last couple of years, the proliferation of crises makes it so that we can't focus on a multitude of crises very well. And so in order to focus on the ones that are inevitably going to slip by, we need to do more to prevent others from coming up, to make our crisis engagement strategy also more effective. So I think that prevention in a specific environment fundamentally succeeds when integrated efforts both address the underlying causes of a conflict, as well as the means and the motives of the leaders, those who are engaging in conflict. And I return to this theme, and I will return to it again, because I think it's critical to remember that ultimately we are dealing with individuals. It's individuals who are making decisions about what to do and what not to do. And so our strategies should focus fundamentally on root causes, issues that Ed outlined as well. But there's also a critical need to focus on the people who are making these decisions. I think that the United States does not devote significant diplomatic or fiscal resources to the early prevention of conflict or atrocities. We certainly devote a lot of money, more not as a percentage of GDP, but more money than anybody else in the world towards development issues and humanitarian assistance issues. And that's fantastic, and most of us want to increase that. But a lot of that is really not targeted specifically at conflict prevention. And very often when you look at U.S. government plans, they'll sort of check the conflict prevention box, because if you help farmers, then maybe it will help avoid hunger, and therefore it'll help avoid a future conflict. But there's not, to my mind, an incredible amount of focused thinking specifically on how to use those interventions and resources specifically to prevent conflict. One of the problems that I think we face at a broad level on conflict prevention is that, first of all, the risk of countries can be quite long. Mark had started off by referencing the work of Barbara Harf and others, people who make these lists of countries that are likely to fall into war or that are at a certain stage of crisis, may lead to atrocities and genocide. And when you're in a place like the NSC and you come to your boss with a list of 25 countries that we absolutely have to do something about today, you might not stay as long as Eric did. And so we have a real challenge in arguing strongly for prevention, and yet not necessarily exactly knowing where prevention is going to be needed the most next year, and therefore probably having to do a lot in a number of places. The second is, of course, conflict prevention suffers from the critical problem of the counterfactual. In other words, to have prevented a conflict is not to have known whether one would have happened otherwise. And so we have to do a better job of being able to convince that investing resources in prevention is not only effective, but that fundamentally it furthers these goals that we're talking about. So let me talk about a few specifics. The overall strategy, I think, for conflict prevention is to simultaneously reduce the capacities and motivations for violence while simultaneously increasing the social and institutional safeguards against mass violence. So you're trying to kind of do this balancing where you want to reduce, as I said before, sort of the means and motives of those who are engaging in conflict, as well as increasing the things that will help a society to either prevent conflict or to get out of it. And I think that this requires fundamentally a focus on three elements: institutions, leadership and civil society. We have to expand the tools that we have to influence leaders and to strengthen the fabric of society in what we identify as being high-risk environments. And this, I think, includes both positive inducements as well as negative pressures. So let me give you a few examples of some of the positive inducements and the negative before closing. Obviously, we can talk about any of these in detail in question and answer. The first on the positive side are the structural approaches. Dealing with rule of law, security sector reform, and good governance, what we often call the state-building piece, I think is fundamental because, again, although it's certainly not always the case, in large part, a lot of these atrocities that we're concerned about are being committed by organized militias or organized armies. And the ways in which those bodies are able to act without accountability has a lot to do with the system of governance, respect for the rule of law, civilian control over the military. In societies that have not yet collapsed, again, we're not talking about necessarily the crisis situation. We're talking about countries before they've engaged in a crisis. There's enormous potential to, I believe, to pay attention to these areas of security sector reform and rule of law in a way that, even though perhaps not preventing all wars, will certainly influence the conduct of conflict and actually in some cases help to prevent the conflict from breaking out. Second, leadership approaches. Again, this comes back to this leader-focused idea. A lot of what we do in the international sort of aid world focuses on institutions, feeding people, that kind of thing. But one of the things that we don't focus on enough, and I think one of the great avatars of this idea is actually a Wilson Center person, Howard Wolpe, who talks really about the software. How do you get leaders in societies in conflict to come out of their zero-sum game perspective on conflict, to learn how to communicate with each other more effectively, and to promote intergroup trust and cooperation. Having spent a lot of time in conflict zones, I do think that there is really something fundamental and missed in this approach, which is that you can do all the other things, but the sort of analog of the political leadership here in the United States is that you do need political leadership on the ground. And very often leaders in conflict got there because of the conflict dynamics that have put them into power. And working with those leaders to get them into a more cooperative framework, into a more trust-building framework with each other, I think is a fundamental step that can be taken. Civil society development is obviously critical. Building a bulwark against opportunistic leaders is fundamental. I was meeting recently with the Minister of Justice of Rwanda, who was talking about some of the things that they're trying to do in a long-term approach in getting the population to think about conflict prevention. And one of the things he said is that, the most important thing that we need in Rwanda is a civil society that will prevent leaders from acting in the ways that they have in the past. Now, in some ways, that might sound naive because, leaders often act, but without regard to what society thinks. But that, again, is in environments where there isn't a strong civil society. And those leaders ultimately do draw a lot of their power from civil society. And so the stronger the accountability is within civil society, the stronger the likelihood is that people, soldiers, citizens, leaders will be making the right decisions. And finally, the question of addressing impunity. I'm very much subscribed to the sort of New York City police broken windows theory of conflict prevention, in that I think that small-scale impunity in the government, in the military, criminality, the types that we see often in societies that are either recently come out of conflict or are heading towards it, is really important to address, because impunity is not just the individual thing that somebody's done. Impunity is sort of an ethic that I think steeps into society and into security forces, essentially that there's no punishment for transgression. And unless there is an understanding that transgression is morally and legally unacceptable and will be punished, I really do think that can have a serious impact. Finally, just to run briefly, because I think I'm out of time, some of the negative things, because I do think that leaders can be influenced. We obviously have aid conditionality, using our aid to potentially steer leaders away from bad actions or preventing them from receiving aid when they're not engaged in the sorts of behaviors that we think are appropriate. Again, this is more of a pre-crisis sort of thing. You have, obviously, public shaming and that sort of thing through regional and international mechanisms. Countering of hate media is something that we saw, obviously, very substantially affecting the Rwanda crisis, and also recently in Kenya. There was a lot of concern about hate media and how that propagated the crisis in the lead-up to the elections. Sanctions. I think that sanctions have been shown to be potentially effective and often problematic because they're easily circumvented. And this really leads us to one of the bigger points that I had meant to make, of course, which is that we can't stand alone in any of these things. Effective action does require serious international engagement, not only at the government-to-government level, but again, I do think that most of the institutions that are engaged in this work most effectively...
Sorry.
0 minutes.
Just the message.
Yeah. So I'll end there, and obviously the protection things in terms of refugees and civilian casualties are things that we can come to during the question and answer.
Tori?
Do I have any time? Okay. Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I've always enjoyed the Woodrow Wilson Center. They have lively and interesting conversations. But I, too, want to heap on praise to Oxfam. I give them credit for doing good in the field and asking tough and difficult policy questions and not being shy about doing so. So congratulations, Ed, on this report and the work that you're doing around that. And I'm going to take the structure of what Oxfam's summary report for my comments. 4 big areas. Why does R2P matter? Why, in my opinion, it's not a theoretical question. I don't think they put it that way, but it's a subset of why it matters. What do we need to do to make it a priority, which seems to be a key theme on this panel? And then I love this part, choosing the future. So if we can choose, let's choose the one we want. First of all, let's just, again, remind ourselves why I think responsibility to protect matters. And I look at this, I'm supposedly the cleanup hitter, the part about the military and peace operations, which all else fails will send in the Marines. But responsibility to protect does talk about putting the responsibility on the state. And in doing so, it doesn't just take off the table the use of force, but it kind of provides a continuum there. And this comes deeply out of the 90s, just to recall, as it's already been mentioned, the experience in Rwanda and Srebrenica, where the world did try to do something. It did send in peacekeepers, and they were unable to provide security. And this parallels the humanitarian group's failures in the 90s, where even the best developed IDP and refugee strategies found that without security, that well-fed civilians who could remain at risk of their lives could try and return home, and still without security not survive. And I bring this up because it very much has pushed R2P forward for very practical operational reasons. So why is this not a theoretical question today? Because while much of responsibly protect, when it gets to the use of force, is cast as a recalibration of humanitarian intervention, and it certainly is in one component, which is that if states fail, that the international community has a responsibility to take action. And that implies the potential threat and even the use of coercive force above and beyond the consent of the government. And from our work on the Genocide Prevention Task Force, there is some rich literature that does suggest when push comes to shove, in the cases of genocide, it is usually state-based and linked to a war. But this is a real problem today, in the sense that we have over 80,000 uniformed personnel on the ground serving in UN-authorized missions, also led by the African Union, the European Union, and in the past, ECOWAS from the West Africa, that have in their mandates to protect civilians under imminent threat. That's a quote. And that evolved out of the late 90s and some of these crises we talked about. I think the first mission you can find that mandate language to, quote, protect civilians under imminent threat is in October of '99 in Sierra Leone, after the rough rebels there killed a lot of people, and the UN mission somewhat collapsed. People were taken hostage, actually, and the world knew we had to do better. Now, this very much may come out of the civilian humanitarian instinct to try and get peacekeeping to, quote, do something, but it does mean that operationally, right now, the peacekeeping missions around the world we have are supposed to, quote, do something. Well, what does that look like? And how do we break that into something that isn't just a story about we need to have the political will? What is actually that to-do list? So before I get to that, let me point out a couple of conundrums with this. Peacekeeping missions are supposed to be with the consent of the government. That means they're not invading. They're there because they've been invited in. Second, there's supposed to be a peace to keep. This is, in the old days, was to uphold a ceasefire or to monitor one. That is no longer the reality of most UN missions today, where the peace to keep is a bit fuzzy, and they're often sent in before that is hammered out. Third, the mandates these days, sure, it says protect civilians, but they're pretty ambitious in many other ways, and peacekeepers are being pressed to do everything from support rule of law and elections to help with economic development. And also the UN peacekeeping system is under massive stress. It's the largest level ever we've seen in the history of the UN, with a number of personnel, that's police, civilians, and military deployed. So these challenges exist, but I can still be cheerful about our to-do list and how you make this a priority. One of the problems for protection is that we don't know what it means when it comes to a military operation. And that's true for whether it's a peacekeeping mission or it's actually an intervention led by a nation. So even though you have it in UN mandates, if you interview military people about what protection means, they understand the Geneva Conventions. They know they need to work with NGOs, and they need to work with humanitarians on the ground to help create, quote-unquote, humanitarian space. And I love Oxfam for developing a protection concept, which talks about how, for example, a camp should be designed so that people who are collecting firewood or trying to use latrine aren't vulnerable. Those are all tangibles. But if you actually get to what either peacekeepers under Chapter 7 in an environment like Darfur or Congo are supposed to do to protect, or you have an imagined humanitarian intervention that's going to protect, it's very hard to find any literature on this. What do I mean by literature? Well, most militaries do things like develop tools. They have doctrine. They develop training. They have rules of engagement, which tell them exactly what to do and the levels of use of force that are appropriate. All of these are scalable to the environment they're expected to go into. So, of the organizations that send in peacekeepers, the United Nations lead among them, as well as the African Union, ECOWAS, NATO, and the European Union, how many of these have well-developed doctrine, training, rules of engagement, and understand leadership courses on how to protect civilians in the missions that they deploy? It's very hard to find evidence of much at all. Doesn't mean they don't have doctrine, doesn't mean there aren't some smart leaders, doesn't mean that these missions can't actually, at the end of the day, provide broad security or respond quickly if there's an incident on the ground. But what we know is those toolkits have yet to be built out. And why is this important? Because, as I mentioned, we've already got forces on the ground. And the other thing we know is that in cases of mass atrocities, genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, there's usually a point when violence escalates. And if we care about prevention, you want to start early. As others have said, you want to start before that violence escalates. Therefore, you need to know what it might look like ahead of time, and if it's escalating, what kind of strategies you have and what your authority is to take action. If I'm a peacekeeper and I'm in Darfur, and there's an incident around a camp, the police are supposed to be in the camp. They may or may not be there. What's my guidance if suddenly some rebels show up? Do I yell at them? Do I return to my barracks? Do I chase them down? What if they set a camp on fire? Do I go in? Do I shoot them? Do I arrest them? Do I follow them? Do I have backup? I don't know. I bring these up because these are real questions that today in missions like Darfur, we still have to see answered. So one option would be you have leadership training, but yet the UN is often not able to have a lot of the capacities that the West would use if this was indeed our own led mission. I've skipped over a lot of this. Some of my information comes from a workshop we held in Ghana a year ago, where we got former force commanders and mission leaders together from some of the worst missions that we've seen, including Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Congo, East Timor, Kosovo, and the Balkans. These guys were generals, they were force commanders, they were chiefs of staff. And 2-1, they said, we all felt implicitly we had to protect, and none of us had good guidance on it. I said, what national doctrine or doctrine did you have from the organizations? They said, sorry, it doesn't really address this. How about training, either long-term training or pre-deployment training? Again, we've got a gap on our hands. It's not just the doctrine question. It's also leadership and knowing ahead of time what you're walking into. And I don't want to take off the table capacity. A couple key things. Any peacekeeping operation or even a larger force needs to be mobile, it needs intelligence and information on what's going on the ground, and it needs to have credibility. And those are three things you can't successfully help protect people with if violence escalates. So I would just put those on the table. All right. All of these could get into a lot more discussion. Let's talk briefly about choosing our future. If you take it back up a level on responsibility protect, the good news that all these 5 organizations I've mentioned, NATO, European Union, African Union, ECOWAS, and the United Nations, are all trying to grapple with this issue. The UN, for the first time ever, has developed its own doctrine, is doing guidance. The African Union is trying to stand up the African Standby Force. The European Union is being seen willing to deploy police and even at times authorize countries like France to go in and provide greater security. And they're all more respectful of the political and humanitarian communities they have to work with. They're trying very hard to have integrated missions. But Responsibility Protect itself has taken a bit of a beating, I understand, politically in New York. We've seen members of the non-aligned movement ask fundamentally, is this the right for other countries to invade us with pretty shaky turf? And I must say that the results of particularly Iraq, but also the difficulties in Sudan, have left for many people a doubt about whether the world community is serious about Responsibility Protect. So that gets the U.S., and I'll say briefly, I think there's some good things going on here. We watched coming out of the Senate last year, thanks to Senator Cardin, an amendment that asked the Departments of State and Department of Defense to report back to the Congress about how the U.S. itself is prepared to guide such missions to protect civilians, whether it's a peace operation or a higher-level intervention. We also see awareness through the National Security Strategy in 2005 that put genocide as a priority for the U.S. to hopefully prevent and, if not, to potentially respond to. Certainly the next president will have a lot on their hands. And I'm hopeful that whoever it is will take this sort of cast of issues seriously, because at the end of the day, I think that the political will depend on operational strategies. In other words, if Eric's back on the National Security Council and he has to write his 10 points about what to do, if he knows what that strategy is, if he knows the difference between a protection mission that is going in to help uphold a ceasefire and a protection mission that has to go in and provide a huge support to a wide range of IDP camps, or a protection mission that has to go in and actually go after belligerents, those are very different missions. And the more he knows about that and the capacities to do it, the more he'll be able to offer good advice, or any of us will. So those would be some quick thoughts, and thank you.
Excellent, Tori. As you all have heard, there's been a rather deep and profound discussion of issues to some degree that demonstrate that these questions remain open and that they have not been resolved, and that the challenge before all of us, and hopefully you'll offer some of the responses that will help the panelists make up their minds about what needs to be done first. I think we have mics on. We do? We do.
Yes.
Questions, comments? Just keep them short. Joel?
Yeah, hi, Joel Charney from Refugees International. We heard a lot about military, diplomatic, justice, security sector reform. I thought it was interesting that even though there were a few references to the humanitarian aspects of protection, no one really addressed that explicitly. And I mean, that's kind of ironic, when you consider that Oxfam, a preeminent humanitarian agency, is issuing this report. And I mean, I haven't read the full report, but from a U.S. standpoint, the U.S. ability right now to respond in a humanitarian sense in a way that protects people displaced by conflict, in my view, has eroded very seriously. And that's something that we have to address going forward. I'm not going to argue that humanitarian/development prevents conflict. I think that's a difficult argument to make. But what about the humanitarian component? I'm a little bit afraid you're backing into this acceptance of it's all about the military when you get right down to it, which feeds into the kind of militarization of our overall approach to international engagement.
That's a particularly important question, and I think I'll go right down the panel, those who want to respond to that quickly. Ed, why don't you start?
Okay, Joel, I absolutely agree. Perhaps I didn't include everything because I wanted you to spend $19.95, I'm sorry, show some of it, on the report. But I totally agree. I guess I'd make two points. If you mean by humanitarian protection what humanitarian agencies can do themselves, I absolutely agree that can be quite a lot, and it's far more than any of us in the community realised 10, 15 years ago. And somebody kindly just mentioned an example that 10 years ago, if Oxfam was citing a latrine, let's be as basic as that, we wouldn't have thought of, are we citing it in somewhere that'll make somebody more vulnerable to violence or less? That wouldn't have been in our minds 10 or 15 years ago. I remember I was on the ground, and now it is. So we deliberately do as much of our work as possible thinking about our responsibility to help make people a bit safer as well as meet their physical needs. And I think that's important, and the whole humanitarian community has to move in that direction. But the second point is, let's be honest, humanitarians aren't particularly modest people, and you can sometimes hear humanitarian agencies talking about humanitarian protection and saying it's a bigger part of the solution than it really is. So I'd say that kind of work is vital, but in the whole scheme of things, I don't think it's going to stop genocide. So I'd say it's vital but modest. And finally, I absolutely don't think we're just saying it's all about military. As somebody said, there's a vast panoply of tools between doing nothing and the military. The military really is, an exceptional resort.
Eric?
Let me answer your question very quickly and then take prerogative to raise another point that Tori made that I think is really critical. And if I go beyond 2 minutes, stop me. But simple answer to your question, I think we have a proliferation of humanitarian activities in search of an overall strategy and strategic focus. And we can discuss remedies. I have some ideas, but since this is being webcast, I'm a little concerned about telling you what they are. No, I mean, I would be prepared to tell you. I think that's the problem. And it's also resources, but it's really just a proliferation of activities in search of a strategy. And we haven't solved that problem. And there have been good suggestions about how to do it. So that's the answer to your question. I want to just, again, take my second minute. I had a student at Princeton last year who came to me to write a junior paper on the Congo mission and the protection of civilians. And he kept writing about the strategic objective of protecting civilians. And I kept knocking the paper back. And I kept saying to him, that's not a strategic objective of this mission. Read the mandate. Read the mandate. And if you read them, and in response to Tori's point, if you read the mandates of these missions that talk about imminent protection of civilians and imminent risk of violence, there's a reason why we don't have a doctrine. We don't have a doctrine because that is an expression. It's not part of the strategic objective of the overall mission, certainly not in the case of Congo. And not that it's not an objective in some sense, but it's not part of the overall strategic focus of it, and it sort of is put in there. So, but that raises the key question, which your comments also raise, which is, if we want to develop doctrine, then, which we probably do, then we need to think much more strategically about the protection of civilians as a strategic objective of the mission. But generally, the way we think, implicitly or explicitly, is let's solve the damn political and security problem, and the civilian, death problem will follow the political solution. Which is why I made the point I made in my opening remarks about the concept has to be clear. Not only R2P, not only address the politics behind the conflict, which creates an environment conducive to peace, but also addressing the suffering before the conflict ends. But I don't think we really... okay, sorry. I made my point. Was that... Yeah, okay.
Anybody else want to comment on that particularly? Go ahead, Tori.
Just to comment, because I think the humanitarian aspects are so important. My point about doctrine is really about having a policy so that the humanitarian strategy, which is often the number 2 slot in a UN mission, can get worked out by the military and the police and the peacekeeping folks knowing what they're about. It's what Eric just said. Is this the driving end of a collection of all the things a peace operation is doing? It is implicitly, but it's a long-term strategy usually. So that means that we've seen peacekeepers freeze in their tracks as people get attacked in front of them or head back to their barracks because they don't know how else to respond. And that doesn't do the humanitarians any good either, because it undermines broad security, and no one wants to see someone get killed. So at the end, I think if the military piece is developed, it should actually give more space and more coherence to the conversation with humanitarians rather than replace it. That would be the hope.
In front. But while you're doing that, I think that, in fact, is the fundamental challenge, that we have to ensure that there's pressure on those who are writing the mandate to ensure that protection of civilians is a fundamental part of the strategic objective of the mission, and that ahead of time they develop the analysis of what that means in terms of a different capacity, and that should be part of the way that you approach every mission. And if you don't, then you're failing in the responsibility to protect responsibility in terms of what it takes.
Yeah, hi, my name's Nikki Smith. I'm with IRC, and I've actually been in the locations with all of the different types of peacekeepers. And one of the things that I would like to mention is something that you've not talked about, which is the inappropriate role that the military are playing in humanitarian aid. And, you know, this being also the 10th suggestion for Eric, that consistent funding and additional funding needs to go into development, both in early recovery post-conflict, as well as the preventional aspects, and linking this to the national security issues rather than using a military force to try and provide national security. And I think, you know, International Violence Against Women Act is looking at this is a Biden and Lugar bill, looking at comprehensive support for women in all stages of conflict and girls to prevent violence against women for protection. And it's a very comprehensive bill and looks at a very large amount of money to be able to, over a long-term strategic way of preventing violence against women and girls. So that's, I think, is my 10th idea. But in terms of this being a segue, is that, you know, there's just increasingly an inappropriate role that the military are playing in the arenas or theaters where they are. And case in point, Georgia, you know, where they're being taken on to do the coordination of the aid. And, you know, quite frankly, for people on the ground, or the humanitarians, what we're asking for is boots on the ground to provide security and protection for the civilians. So therefore, the plethora of agencies on the ground can actually do that work. And I think that this is incredibly worrying, and it's an increasing trend. And when you see that 20% of the budget goes now through the military, you know, it's just very inappropriate. So whilst, you know, I think that we're very supportive of that, I think that the military are on the ground and that they're providing security, there isn't an inappropriate role too. And I think that, and my last point is just about the political will. I mean, look at Sudan, where, you know, there has been a diplomatic engagement, there has been a military engagement, but there's no political will to make a difference for people on the ground to the next stage. And I think that could also be a worrisome trend in other countries where, you know, if we do engage, we don't engage enough. So rather than a genocide in a short period of time that we see in Rwanda, you see suffering and a genocide happening over a longer period.
Thank you. Why don't we take two other comments before we have the panel respond? Over here.
My name is Deirdre Lepin. I'm a resident scholar here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank all of you for your very reflective and stimulating comments. The question that keeps coming back to my mind, based on the low-intensity conflicts that I've been studying, is how do you define and or identify a civilian? That is, that innocent individual or group that's not engaged in armed conflict. Because of poverty, so many individuals and communities are being co-opted by rebel groups or forcibly recruited or compelled to cooperate with their activities. And at the same time, they become targets of indiscriminate action by soldiers in response. So how do you know on the ground what to do with such groups?
In the back, the gentleman all the way in the back.
I'm David Sullivan with the Enough Project. I think the importance of political will from above has been correctly noted, but that another important issue we need to discuss is political will from below, and that unless American citizens see the links between human security abroad and their own security, you're unlikely to see the will for effective reorganization of America's various components of national security defense, diplomacy, development. And if you don't have that, then you're going to see a reshuffling of the outline where all of the various bureaucracies are able to check the box for R2P without there being a real effective change in behavior. And so my question is, how do you start making that case to the American people that reorganizing the government bureaucracy, which when you think about how much of the tools of foreign policy, from foreign aid to defense, is sort of governed by constituencies and the need to deliver results to voters in congressional districts, how do you start rechanging that debate? Thanks.
Okay. Panel? Whoever wants to respond to any of those three?
Ed is first.
Okay. Since I'm not an American, I don't think I will respond to the third. But perhaps I should just say, in the UK, that argument is slowly being won. I think compared with 10 years ago, I think people are aware that, conflicts even thousands of miles away have some security. We live in an independent world. 95% of hard drugs come from conflicts. I'm not personally a huge fan of our former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, but he did a very good job in leading that debate in the UK. But obviously I'm the least qualified to answer that. Quickly on the other things, I entirely agree with you, Nikki, the thing about the inappropriate use of provision by the military of humanitarian aid, or is it humanitarian aid if they do it? And I don't think you mentioned, if you did, forgive me, but sort of one of our concerns is obviously that kind of blur the lines in the perceptions of enemy combatants, and for so many examples, it's not worth giving many, but we've had our Afghanistan offices bombed. We haven't thankfully had any of our staff killed in Afghanistan, but many other people have, and there are some statements from the Taliban and others sort of looking at that link. So I think that is very dangerous, and it shouldn't happen. There are international guidelines, as you know, from the UN and others. There's no real use for it. What is a civilian? That's a very difficult question, and has been argued about for decades. I'm not an international lawyer. Somebody probably is better qualified than me to answer it, because I appreciate that things can get a bit blurry. My understanding of international humanitarian law was something along the lines of that, and if you're talking about somebody who is not in uniform and is not part of an armed group, unless that person is actually taking up arms at that moment, then the other forces should err on thinking of that person as a civilian and not as a combatant. So I think, and wouldn't be a detailed legal answer to you. It's a good point, but I think basically, despite the difficulties of blur between combatant and civilian, the right thing to do is to err on the side of seeing more people as civilians.
Who would like to?
A couple of brief responses. I think this issue of the military being engaged in humanitarian assistance is critical, and of course, something that Eric also outlined in his talk. I mean, we are in this vicious cycle in the United States of diminished civilian capacity, the military's perceived need to respond to crises, the absence, therefore, then of civilian capacity to respond to those, the money being already readily available, as well as enormous amounts of lift capacity and people to do planning and so on in the military. And so you just have this cycle where you have this repeated return to the military. And I think that the only way that we break that cycle is what I think Eric may have been suggesting, and certainly a lot of people, including folks from Enough Project and so on, that there just needs to be a really dramatic change in United States civilian capacity to deliver foreign assistance at an operational level. I think that all of our nation-building experiences since the end of the Cold War, and particularly Afghanistan and Iraq, demonstrate that if we're going to be engaging in these efforts, and hopefully we won't be engaging in more Iraqs, but we are going to keep doing this as Bosnia, East Timor, whatever, that we really need to dramatically enhance our civilian capacity to deliver not only humanitarian assistance, but the military is also engaging in, they're looking at things like judicial reform. I mean, they're right now there's a civilian affairs manual, doctrine manual being drafted about military engagement in rule of law reform. And so it wouldn't just limit it to the humanitarian problem, where in many ways humanitarian assistance, I think, has been relatively more successful in some environments because of the capacity of the military to respond quickly to crises. Where I start to get more scared of it is when you're talking about the sort of, you look at the provincial reconstruction team example, where it was supposed to be sort of civilians doing the governance work with military sort of backing up and doing security, and the civilians really never showed up, and the military is then involved in sort of trying to enhance lines of governance, and I think it's deeply problematic. The point that I wanted to make about the question of Americans is something that we looked a lot about in the Genocide Prevention Task Force as well, because obviously it's fundamental. You need broad grassroots support, and I think that the clear lesson is that Americans believe strongly in preventing widespread civilian casualties, in humanitarian assistance, and so on. What they don't believe in, and perhaps in some justified sense, is the capacity of our government to do that. And so I think some of the resistance to foreign aid comes from this misperception that we give a lot more aid than we do, one, but also from the perception that our government's not effective at doing this. I mean, you look at responses to major earthquakes and tsunamis. I mean, Americans open up their pockets in billions of dollars in days to give to crises around the world. I don't think the problem is a normative one, although I think that bears reinforcing. The problem is really demonstrating that there's an effective government and NGO private sector partnership that can actually deliver effectively on these promises.
Tori?
Oops, I'm done. No, on identifying who's who on the ground and who potential belligerents are, and even people who cross from being so-called innocent civilians to belligerents, I think this is a nub of a big problem. And so two thoughts on this. One, that gets back to the argument of figuring out what the protection strategies are. And again, I'm talking about the military, but that's so that everybody in the mission, the humanitarians, the political leaders, everybody operating has a general grip. But if we broke down what past strategies have been, one theory is that peacekeepers can just show up, and by their general presence, they deter. And so that doesn't mean you have to know who the belligerents are, and that can work. Another one is you go to protect the civilians where they are, and either they're there because they live there, it's a village, or they sense danger and there's fleeing, and that could be a church or a stadium or an IDP camp or a whole other country. So again, that doesn't require that you know who the belligerents are to potentially do successful protection strategies if it's a defensive stance you take. The third, if you're looking at a sort of a continuum of use of potential coercion, the third would be you try and protect by breaking up the ability of belligerents to act. And that can be anything from having checkpoints to breaking them up, controlling roads. A much more extreme version would be a no-fly zone. In other words, you can map out all these strategies. So the actual place where you get to going after a group of people who potentially are armed and shooting them is further down the road. And one strategy is, it was used in Ituri in the summer of 2003, I think it was, that they declared a certain area a no weapons visible zone. So they didn't ask who you were, they just said no guns. Again, I don't know if that works, but there's knowledge out there we could use on this. And just again, I'm focusing a lot on peace operations in the UN. There are some beginning uses of particularly panels of experts who go to the field to figure out why targeted UN sanctions in places like Congo and Sudan, Somalia, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Sierra Leone don't work. And what's fascinating about these reports is not just that sanctions aren't particularly working, is it comes back and it names who's running the guns. It says who's corrupt. It takes pictures in Sudan of who's flying the planes by the rebels and by the government. And to my knowledge, it's one of the few organizations that the UN hires to come back and tell them the straight story. And these things are published and they're online. So more work like that could hook up with the missions can also tell us about patterns of belligerence, and I think that's useful.
I was going to say something. I'm not going to try to address them all. I'll try to address the issue of the U.S. public, the American public. I agree that I think there is a reservoir of support in the American public for active engagement on these whole cluster of issues. And it's not only about the use of military force. In some cases, for example, in the Muslim world, in Sudan in particular, you have real questions about how the United States wants to deploy military force in vindicating the responsibility to protect. But I think there is a reservoir of support. The tsunami was the clearest example of that. I also think that Alex is absolutely right. We have to communicate, our leadership has to communicate that government serves a valuable purpose. Otherwise, the American public is going to perceive that any effort we undertake on any issue is not going to be successful. So there's got to be, and I think it's as much a change of perception as it is in reality, because our government probably does better than the last 8 years of rhetoric has suggested it does do, unless, of course, you're talking about political appointees to FEMA. But the third point, and I think the most important one, is notwithstanding the critical importance of the work that you guys do, again, this has got to come from the top. The interest, no matter what you all do, the interest at the end of the day on these kinds of crises in the United States is going to be about a mile wide and maybe an inch, maybe based on your work, 2 inches deep. And so if an American president isn't able to portray what it is we're doing and the interests that we're trying to serve in a compelling way to the American people, nothing's going to happen.
We'll make one more round of questions. There's a woman there, right there in the white.
Hi, Bridget Moix with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Thanks very much to Oxfam for the report and to all the panelists. I really appreciate not only the focus on protection, but also on prevention. And this is more on prevention than I've heard in a while. I've been away for a while, but I really appreciate that focus. My question goes to both the capacities for prevention here within the U.S. government and also the question of political will. And it has to do with, Eric, you mentioned some of the agencies, CMM in USAID, SCRS, Conflict Prevention Program, and the intelligence groups that are collecting information, and the need for a more integrated early warning system. And Mark, you said basically nothing exists. So my question is, what would an integrated, effective early warning system for the U.S. government look like? And what are the tools that we're missing, and how can we build that? And then once we have that, then still the question to me is, how do you get the political will? Because operating as Congress does, as Washington does around crises, until the violence is underway, it's very hard to get the information in a timely way to policymakers so that they're going to actually take action. So once we build that capacity, how do you actually get the political will?
Some of the panelists are going to have to leave, and so I'm going to let Eric go respond right to that.
I have to get to a train, so I've got 1 minute. So I won't give you a full answer to your question. And let me answer the second part of your question, because the first part of your question is kind of complicated, and there are different positions on it. How do you integrate these coordinated efforts? But I have always taken the view that the issue is not provision of information in the U.S. government. It never has been. The information is usually there, not always, but usually there. The issue is packaging it in a way that is compelling, but more important than even that, figuring out a way to get it to the most senior level decision makers. And I hate to sound like a one-note record on this, a broken record on this, but it's about putting responsibility in the White House. I genuinely believe, because if it's at the NSC and somebody is a stuckee, then if the fat hits the fire and something doesn't happen, then there's somebody responsible who's relatively close to the president who hasn't done his or her job. And I really think it's got to be there. I don't mean that I don't think the NSC should be an operational institution. I don't think you want to pack too much stuff there. But there's got to be that level. There's got to be someone there or an office there whose responsibility is to scan the horizon and put up to principals, to put up to the president, an issue which if it's not put up there, 6 months later, the president's going to say, how come it wasn't? I'm going to have to run out. I'm sorry.
Tori, I think, has the answer to the first part of your question.
Read the Genocide Prevention Task Force report, which will come out in December. There's a big chapter on early warning, and I can let Alex answer that. No, I want to, before Eric walks out, I do think it's leadership at the top levels, but those people are going to be staffed by somebody who has to turn around and say, uh-oh, I got to put the options paper together. And if there's no one below who it's their day job to think about this, then they're going to be making it up with some smart people they lock in a room for a day and a half. That is a bad way to figure these problems out. So, yes, you want the president involved, but you need in the machinery of our government people whose day job it is to think about this. Whether they watch international institutions, they're a regional desk officer, they're an early warning expert, and they need to think about this before the crisis hits. There's a difference between long-term and thoughtful planning and crisis response. So I would just add that, amend that to Eric's answer.
And as you walk out there, as you walk out, I'll just add to that I do think that we've come to the point now that you need to have within the U.S. government this raised to the level of top priority in terms of the way we deal with the outside world. What does that mean? It means that we need to have a Department of Development, Conflict Prevention, and Humanitarian Action at the cabinet level that focuses, in fact, this issue as a fundamental priority, not merely in terms of responding after the fact, but acting with respect to prevention, and not waiting until it's going to take military action, but in fact dealing with the issues of development and on conflict response at the level of analysis, at the level of dealing with the root causes, and at the level of bringing together all of the resources of the government, yes, to then advise the president of what should be done. But it needs to be raised to a much higher level if we're going to have the ability to respond in a different way than we've done thus far. And it has to be done in conjunction with the rest of the international community. That department needs to then be engaging with a comparable, expanded capacity within DPA or within the UN that has that as its responsibility.
Just to give away one of the
Alex is going to have the last comment of the panel, and then unless others want to have a final statement.
Yeah. Well, to give away one of the, the critical things that we're going to be recommending that really goes to the heart of this, I think, is in addition to the political will issues and so on, is building in a system, and that is two parts. A little bit elaborating on what Eric said, it involves two things: automaticity and funding. So on the automaticity side, in our proposal anyway, there would be a requirement that there is a high-level meeting, often what's called a deputies level committee meeting, that reviews a product which is already produced by the CIA, which is not public, called the Atrocities Prevention Watch List. That every time that is issued, and perhaps it would be issued more frequently, there would be a meeting an order of bidding to review what are we doing about these different countries, and then to add to that resources. That within the NSC structure and an increased civilian structure housed at the State Department, you would actually have increased resources above and beyond what the country teams already have to focus immediately on undertaking additional conflict prevention or crisis reaction efforts, because it doesn't do any good if you've got somebody who's supposed to be watching these things and they've got no way to get it up to the top, which is what Eric was saying. You have to have that. And one of the ways you create that is through an automatic function where it has to be reviewed at least every 2 months or when somebody requests it outside of that. And then the second piece is actually then giving them something to do with it, not say, oh, what are we going to do about this, but actually to have some resources within an organized interagency system so that resources are available and can be distributed to respond to those emerging crises.
On behalf of all of the members of the panel, I want to thank you in the audience and also thank the panelists. I clearly want to thank Oxfam for having put out this, not a call to arms, but a call to end arms. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much.
Project.
Oh,
Thank
great.
you so much. Very good.
Thank you, everyone. And remember that on October 28th, the Leadership Project, in partnership with the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, will be here once again to discuss this very same topic with Gareth Evans and Pending panel. Thank you.